Another week has come and gone as we are back with yet another review for the latest episode of BLEACH's 1000-Year Blood War arc anime. Depending on what type of fan you are, this episode may have easily been the one that you were most concerned about or the one that you were most excited for. Personally, I have had a mixture of feelings leading up to the release of episode 20. This is probably one of the most highly anticipated fights in the entirety of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime adaptation. It features the fan favorite KENPACHI'S making his triumphant return to the battlefield with his newly acquired powers, combined with his opponent who just so happens to have one of the most overpowered Broken Shrift abilities that we have seen to date. To say that there was a great deal of hype leading up to this episode would be an understatement. Now, why did I say that there were concerns for this episode? Well, the first reason that I was fearful for episode 20 is because it adapts manga material that spans from chapter 571 and it takes us all the way up to the midpoint of chapter 579, meaning that this week's episode adapts an unprecedented 8.5 chapters worth of manga material. And this is unlike any other episode of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, because on average the anime has been adapting roughly 5 chapters worth of manga material. So in other words, this episode has adapted the entirety of BLEACH volume 64 titled Death in Vision. After considering how some of the episodes have turned out that ended up adapting a large number of chapters, I started to think that this week's episode may either turn out to be an instant classic that's going to be remembered like the iconic episode 6 where Yamamoto had fought Yubak, or it could also turn out to be one of the biggest disappointments of the season. Or rather, the second biggest disappointment, since you know that the One Piece live action is coming out at the end of August, but I'll talk about that in another video. In the end, did episode 20 I Am the Edge live up to our expectations, or did it crash and burn under the weight of its own hype? Be sure to stick around until the end of this video, where I'm going to be breaking down my thoughts on how KENPACHI'S battle against Gremmy was adapted into anime form, as well as speaking about any new scenes that were included and if the anime staff ended up doing justice to KENPACHI'S incredible Shikai form. So without further delay, here are my thoughts on the all-new BLEACH 1000-Year Blood War arc episode. Let's kick things off by discussing the story and the pacing, which in my opinion was the greatest challenge that the production team had to face this week, considering that they needed to find a way to cram 8.5 chapters into the limited runtime of the episode. Let's discuss how the anime staff for the most part were able to successfully pull this off, albeit with some areas of the episode feeling really rushed. So the episode begins where we had left off last week at the end of chapter 570, where Guana Lee had made his entrance and had started to attack Yachiro and Isane. This was honestly surprising, as I had envisioned that the anime would have skipped this entire Yachiro fight, so that the episode would have opened up with Gremmy appearing and taking out Guana Lee. I was pleasantly surprised to see that this brief encounter was left intact for the most part. The first 5 minutes of the episode is dedicated entirely to adapting the conflict between Guana Lee and Yachiro. This adaptation is however not without several cuts, so I highly recommend that you stay tuned to the channel by subscribing for my follow-up video that I'm posting tomorrow, where I will be explaining everything that is being cut from this week's episode in detail. Knowing that this episode was adapting a high chapter count, admittedly I was counting the minutes down that were being spent on Yachiro's fight with Guanal, because for every minute spent on this fight, it meant that we would lose a minute from KENPACHI'S fight. The amount of stress that this part of the episode had given me is honestly hilarious to think about in hindsight, but luckily another minute and a half was all that it had taken for the main man of the moment to make his grand entrance, as Gremmy emerges and takes out his own creation. Overall, I was pleased with the beginning of the episode. There wasn't anything negative to really say about it, aside from Guanal having several lines of internal monologue being cut from the anime, but honestly it didn't really matter if in the end it had resulted in Gremmy having more screen time. The art and animation was also great during these early portions of the episode, and my mind was finally at ease after seeing KENPACHI confront Gremmy. With KENPACHI finally making his arrival, things begin to pick up, but his entrance however comes with its own challenges, as we see him deliver the heartbreaking news of Unohana's death to Isane. Personally, I think that the anime had handled this incredibly well, as it takes a break from the action in order to deliver to us some somber news, with Isane's voice actor doing an amazing job with her emotional performance here. You'd think that an episode with this much to do would race through this scene in particular, but surprisingly we spend a good 40 or so seconds where the two of them exchange exchange words with each other. Following this, KENPACHI'S battle against Gremmy truly begins, but not before we see some amazing visuals of the beaten Zanpakuto of KENPACHI, as we are shown the title card of this week, I Am the Edge, appear on screen. We then immediately reach the midpoint of the episode, with material being adapted all the way up until the end of chapter 573. The second half of the episode, including the post-credit scene, focuses on adapting 5.5 chapters worth of manga material. There is a considerable amount of streamlining with the content in this section of the episode, as we have omissions like reactions from the Shinigami who are surrounding KENPACHI and Gremmy's battle, along with an exchange between Pepe and Askin being cut from the anime, and reactions from Bazby, Askin, Renji, Hashward and Yuhobak being cut after Gremmy summons his meteor. What you'll notice is that there is a heavy emphasis placed upon just cutting to the chase, as unnecessary lines from the manga are not adapted into the anime. I have to admit that I loved how Gremmy's powers were animated in the episode, from how he creates the platform where his battle against KENPACHI occurs, then when he conjures his lava, as well as trapping KENPACHI in a cube of water, along with when he had summoned the weaponry to fire at KENPACHI, and who could forget the incredible way that the anime handles his meteor scene. CGI was used in several background shots, but it's nothing that we haven't seen before. The most noticeable shot involving CG was when Gremmy had summoned the weaponry to fire at KENPACHI. Personally, I love the way that this was animated, and I thought that the addition of CG combined with 2D art and excellent art direction had really elevated this scene in particular. One of my favorite moments from this episode was definitely the Shikai reveal of KENPACHI. I think that the anime nailed the execution of this moment. On the other hand, there were several scenes from the last few minutes of the episode which were disappointing in my opinion, because this is where I'd felt that the pacing of the episode was really affected, as I could feel them rushing through some of the content. I felt this in particular during the scene where KENPACHI is trapped in space. I felt that it wasn't as impactful in the anime in comparison to the manga. And lastly, the defeat of Gremmy felt really lackluster, with the art feeling off-model and how quickly things had started to resolve within the anime. Now, before you start going crazy in the comments, I am aware that Gremmy's defeat is only a matter of a couple of pages in the manga, but because Kubo's art is so detailed within these pages, my eyes were staring at the page where Gremmy's body is torn apart for a while, as I was taking in the ruptured muscle tendons, as well as Gremmy's oversized body that could not contain the power of KENPACHI as it eventually succumbs to its limits. The anime really didn't do the manga page justice in my opinion, because of the off-model art, the lack of detail in the art, and the overall rushed feeling that the conclusion of the episode ended up having. There is a lot to love about this episode, but I think that I'd be lying to myself if I wasn't going to point out the glaring aspects of this episode where I wish that there was way more love and attention given to. I do appreciate that my criticisms are probably a mixture of my insanely high expectations for this week's episode not being met. So for this reason, I want to know if you too felt a strange feeling of emptiness after this episode had wrapped up. I just didn't know what to think, because in the end, I wasn't blown away by this week's installment of the 1000 Year Blood War arc anime. I was super excited going into the episode, but after having watched it, I was ultimately left feeling conflicted. On a more positive note, Sagisu's music is impeccable, and I loved the emotional OSTs that had played during Gremmy's defeat and during his final words. Let's now shift the discussion over to the animation of the episode. There have been many discussions surrounding the overall quality of the animation for Core 2, rightfully so, as fans have high expectations for this season, and they want it to be a step up from what we had received within Core 1. Sakuga enthusiasts have been performing remarkable feats of mental acrobatics in their attempts to persuade us that Noriyuki Abe, the director of the original 2004 Bleach anime, would have apparently made a better adaptation of the 1000 Year Blood War arc. And well, yeah, I couldn't think of a better joke. This episode, just like the others from this core, has some absolutely fantastic art direction, and time again we have seen the anime staff consistently replicate some very iconic manga panels and translate them in a manner that absolutely outclasses even Kubo's original vision from the manga. And this, in my opinion, is the highest praise that we can give to the staff behind the 1000 Year Blood War arc anime. This aspect of the anime can be attributed to the chief animation director of today's episode, Kiyoshi Komatsubara. manga. Now while for the majority of the part the episode nails some iconic manga panels, like I'd mentioned earlier, there were some moments where characters went off model quite a bit, and my own personal take about the defeat of Gremmy, which I think the anime definitely could have done better. The episode is helmed by director Yusaku Kikuchi, a rather new face on the production team who has risen through the ranks from Core 1 to now earning the credit of an episode director. While it's a commendable achievement on his part, I would have much preferred director Taguchi himself, or at least a veteran like Takashi Hashimoto or maybe even Atsushi Wakabayashi to take over such an iconic episode like this one. Because while the storyboard made by Wataru Yamamoto was absolutely fantastic, I did find that Kikuchi had some difficulty in bringing out the full potential of the storyboard. Let's talk about this storyboard for a second. With this being the first time that Yamamoto had worked on a Bleach episode, I had no idea what to expect since his work on the Osomatsu anime was really all that I could use as a reference. From seeing the episode, his contributions pleasantly surprised me. His storyboarding was definitely one of the highlights for this week's episode, especially with how he had often framed certain scenes. In particular, the scene involving Gremmy's meteor. I'm not sure if the animator had storyboarded his own cut, but the end result was absolutely fantastic. From how the anime had built up to the scene and had eventually executed it. I'm not even joking when I say that Bleach really ended up having one of the best meteor destruction scenes in all of anime. This now brings us to the animation of the episode. Episode 20 was full of well done cuts, which come as no surprise considering we had talented animators like Torinosuke Hori, Mitchell Gonzalez, and Jason Yao. This episode featured multiple really well animated cuts that made the episode quite fun to get through. But the highlight of this week's episode easily has to be the meteor destruction scene, as I've mentioned several times. It was gorgeous through and through, from the fantastic build up leading up to Kenpachi running towards the meteor and the insane scale that the animation gave a slash and the resulting impact, which ended up being an absolute feast for our eyes. In summary, the episode was really well animated, with the highlight being the meteor scene, and in general, animation wise, it was an episode that once again raises the bar, and I cannot wait to see where Core 2 goes from here. So that was episode 20, I Am the Edge. It is an episode that took me by surprise in more ways than one, considering the fact that the staff for this episode consisted of relatively new faces, and the ones we did know had never gotten the chance to show off their full potential. So despite all of this, I wasn't really expecting this episode to turn out to be this good. The animation, storyboarding, and of course the music were all fantastic. But sincerely speaking, I believe that the director needs a great amount of praise for a newcomer. It's been quite the delight watching him progress since Core 1, and it would be quite interesting to see how much he has grown by the end of Core 4. The biggest challenge of this episode was the sheer amount of content that they needed to go through, and for the most part, I would like to think that they did a fair job at it. If you want to know just how well they did, I'll be back tomorrow with an in-depth comparison of the manga against the anime, where I'll be going over all of the scenes that were added, everything that was cut, and all of the general changes that were made in comparison to the manga, and how all of these differences had ultimately affected the pacing of the story in the anime. So you definitely don't want to miss my follow-up video that I'll be uploading tomorrow, where I'll give my final thoughts on the episode, with next week adapting the long-awaited return of Ichigo onto the battlefield, with him possibly clashing with the Bambis. It is easily going to be one of my most highly anticipated moments from Core 2, and I cannot wait to see how it is handled in the anime. Personally, I'm super excited for episode 21 that is titled The Headless Star. But until then, let me know your thoughts on episode 20, I Am the Edge. Did you feel like the episode did justice to the manga? I look forward to reading all of your comments, and lastly, thank you for making it to the end of this video, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for my in-depth breakdown of the new Bleach episode in my follow-up manga vs anime video tomorrow. If you enjoy my content, then you can support my channel through Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or even through YouTube by becoming a channel member. You will gain access to exclusive channel perks and a Discord server which I frequently use. So become a member of my Zero Division and be the first to know about my upcoming videos. And once again, thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.